Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today we're going to be talking about communication and conflict in public consultations. I'm not sure about the situation in your own home countries, but in Poland the subject of public consultations is quite a new one, and that's why it has to be approximated and explained to people who both organize and take part in such consultations. So in my lecture, I'm going to concentrate on communication and conflict, and basically we're going to have a look at these issues first of all in general, basing on issues connected with psychology, and later on we're going to look at specific problems associated with social consultations. We're going to have a look at particular examples. So first of all, let's talk about communication in general, and later on we'll pass to talking about communication in public consultations. So the basics concerning effective communication. One, of course, we all know intuitively what communication is, but if you wanted to define it, communication is a dialogue which consists of listening and speaking. And of course, in order to communicate, we need two people who are in a certain emotional relationship, and they aim to express their opinions, feelings, and so on and so forth. And during such a dialogue, we have a little influence on the way that our partner is going to behave, but we have a lot of influence on the way that we are going to behave. So in order for our dialogue, communication to be constructive, we need to communicate well and in an effective way. Of course, there are some certain interpersonal abilities, skills that we may or may not have, but there are also some basic principles that we may use, such as we should not generalize and we should not hastily interpret what the other party says. We should not be judgmental, so pass judgment on other people too quickly. We should not give good advice, especially if we're not asked for such advice. We should let ourselves be known to the other party and openly express our needs, emotions, and our proposals. And we should concentrate on our interlocutor. And this leads me to my next point, that is active listening. You may think that listening is a passive skill because after all someone is speaking and we're just kind of sitting there and taking in or not taking in information. But we can actually make listening active, and then it's going to be much more efficient, and then it's going to facilitate communication. So paradoxically, in order to listen actively, we sometimes need to speak as well. So what can we do in order to listen actively? We can paraphrase what the other person is saying in order to enable them to clarify their point. So if I understood you right, if I get that right, and so on, we can use such statements. We can use the so-called mirroring technique. So first of all, what we say should be mirrored in our gestures. So for example, if we're saying that we're open to negotiations and the gesture that we're making is something like this, then we're creating a contradiction. And so this is something that we obviously should not do. And another aspect of mirroring is actually mirroring the gestures of the other person, which will make them feel much safer, because then subconsciously they see that they're on a safe ground. And we can also use a technique which is called directing, or guiding rather. So we can guide the other person through conversation or dialogue. So basically, if someone is speaking in a chaotic way, we can summarize what they have said, and in this way we introduce some order into the way that they're speaking. So let's now pass to communication in public consultations. And let's start from the very first step. So how to formulate your communication, how to formulate the poster on the forthcoming social public consultations, let's say. This is before we pass to actual face-to-face communication. Because if we fail to prepare our communications right, nobody's going to come to our meetings. Our beautiful materials are going to remain unread, completely untouched. And the information will basically not reach our addressee. So we're going to answer 3 basic questions. So what to communicate, how to communicate it, and where to communicate. And then we're going to look at some examples. So the first important decision, what to communicate. So basically, we should communicate everything that is necessary. This is a bit of a platitude, but among these necessary things, we've got issues such as what is going to be consulted, what is the framework of the consultation, so what is going to be negotiated and what is not negotiable. If there are certain scenarios or options available, you have to mention them as well. And we have to be very careful not to overload our communications with information, but we should rather direct our addressees to a place where they can get more information. So, for example, traditionally it would be a website. We should, of course, provide all the information connected with the way that such consultations are organized. So, whom we can contact from, let's say, the municipal office or any other office. So, their name, surname, their position, when they're available at the office, their phone number, and their email address, so that everybody knows from whom they can get information if they need such information. And again, pointing to a source where they can find more detailed, very often more specialized information. So websites, additional materials, or a list of organized supporting events. We could also, or we rather should, specify the ways in which people can contact the local government or the office. So, for example, should they write an email? Should they send a letter? Should they vote on the internet? Should they take part in a meeting? And so on and so forth. And especially in places which don't have a long tradition of such consultations, it's very important to emphasize the benefits for people who take part in such meetings. Because, of course, they're going to involve their time, their attention, and in general, they're going to get involved in the procedure. So that's why we have to show them that this is indeed beneficial. And the last thing that we should do is specify the effect of such consultations, because as I've been saying, in some places people don't quite know what such public consultations are, so we have to tell them what effect they can expect so that they're not disappointed and discouraged later on. People may often have a tendency to think that such consultations are a form of a referendum or a public opinion poll, while this is not quite true. So we have to specify whether they're going to make a decision or whether their voice is just advisory. This is quite important. And this will make for people taking part in such consultations more eagerly in the future, because if they feel cheated, obviously they will not want to take part in consultations in the future. So these were the do's, and what about the don'ts? So what shouldn't we do? So we must not manipulate information. The aim is to present all information in an honest and simple way. We should not overemphasize some issues that do not deserve such an overemphasis, and we should not underemphasize some issues that should perhaps be pronounced in a more visible way. We should not promise too much, especially we should not make unrealistic promises, because usually public consultations are just in order to advise authorities on what to do. So the voice of the people who, inhabitants of the area are just, the voice is just advisory. So again, we should not create a false image that the inhabitants are going to make a decision if they're actually not going to make a decision. And this is again in order not to get people discouraged from future participation in in public consultations. And we should not flood people with unnecessary detail. This is a frequent problem because people who are professionals know these things and they know all the conditions for example, certain choices. But we have to be aware that an average person does not want and does not need all these details because they're going to get lost. The second important question is how to communicate, and there we've got a very important point concerning the point of view that we have to assume. So first of all, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of people who know nothing about the subject. If our target group is quite wide, we always have to assume that we're speaking, we're writing to the person with that our addressee feels like reading it and in such a way that the message is understandable. So it's quite wise to formulate it in such a way that it's an invitation, that you're actually inviting someone to take part in an event. And if we do so, this message should be signed by the representative of the local government or of some kind of an office. We have to inform our addressees who organizes the whole event and whom it is going to affect the possible changes. As regards the graphic form, of course, we have to opt for something that is eye-catching, because we have to remember that our addressees are going to read our poster, let's say, for example, when queuing for a bus or just, waiting for the green light, let's say. So probably they wouldn't have much time to read it in depth. Of course, the text should be clear in this way that it should not be organized into blocks of text, just like in a newspaper, but it has to be graphically clear. It's necessary that the language that is used is basically exemplary. That is, that it should be understandable, it should have a clear positive message, and it should show a clear wish to communicate and to get to know different opinions. We could refer to common good, because after all, this is what public consultations are for. And what is also very wise to include is something that is called an executive summary. That is a few sentences summarizing the content of our message, just like an executive would get, in order not to get burdened with too much detail. So, for example, if we're considering different options, we could include a table which compares these options. Then the information can be understood in a very quick and efficient way. I'm going to show you two examples. Well, both of these examples, to be frank, are quite good, to be honest, because Anglo-Saxon countries have a lot of experience with preparing public consultations. So have a look at the first one. When it comes to the first one, there are a few reservations. So public consultations, A47 Parkway and Litchfield Road, cycle routes. And a short description and the call onto the addressees to do something which is not very clear. We strongly recommend that all local residents and businesses find out more about how they're affected by the proposed changes. And for more information, please visit. So we've got a website where we can see more, where we can find more information, but it's by no means clear what we have to do. And this is not very encouraging because, well, we should find out how we're affected, but what then? What to do? Should we, I don't know, send an email saying that we disagree? Should we organize a street protest? What is it that we should do? And then there's information that the consultation closes on Wednesday, the 12th of November 2014, which is important, but still we have no clue what to do, and we actually don't know what is going to be happening. Proposed changes is a very vague way of putting things. So this information, this communication is not very clear. Let's have a look at the second one, which is much better. Again, we've got the slogan, have your say. Obviously, this is important. Have your say on proposed changes to opening hours at your local library. All right, now we know what is going to be proposed, what we should have our say on or about. Have your say by Wednesday, online, in your local library, by email, by Facebook, and find more at. So again, we've got these different channels of communication. Again, this poster could be a little clearer because we don't know what the authorities or what some kind of a library association is planning to do. Well, you may guess that probably they're going to be cutting the hours of when libraries are open, but we can't be sure of that. But certainly we can have our say concerning the fact, concerning the times when we use the library, when we would find it most convenient to use a library. So when libraries should be open. So this is actually a bit simpler, but this is more effective. So these were the two examples. And another issue, that is the third question that we were meant to answer, is where to communicate. And the simplest rule is, well, we should communicate in such places, we should put our communication in such places where it could be found by our target group and where it would find our target group. So where our target group would come across it, not even looking for it. And I wanted to show you one more example. This is an example actually from the part of Krakow where I live. And here it is exactly specified where a project is going to be taking place, because the posters say this is the place where the super path is going to be. They have a project in my district that instead of something, which I'm not quite sure of what, they're going to organize well some kind of a park with a lot of facilities for neighbors, for people who live in the area, basically. So this is actually very important because obviously people who live in the area, the inhabitants of this district, will be interested in what to include in this park or in this super path, as they call it. There was a lot of information around. I have noticed a lot of information on bus stops, on tram stops, a lot of leaflets and so on, but still not very many people attended the consultations. But well, anyway, there was a voting and they managed to choose one option of how to organize this area. So, returning to the issue of where to communicate. So we could communicate in the area that is going to be affected by the changes. This is most obvious. And we could also communicate kind of moving along the way of target groups that are going to be affected by the proposed changes. So, for example, if let's say creating a local park is going to be planned, or introducing some kind of changes into a local park, for example, putting benches, putting sandboxes, and creating a playground for children, we could consider that there are several groups of people that are going to be affected, and that's why interested. So, for example, the elderly, young kids and their parents, and youth, young people. So, when it comes to the elderly, we could inform them about proposed changes by preparing leaflets, and rather not putting information on the internet, because the elderly would not use internet on a massive scale. And we would have to remember that these leaflets have to be understandable. They have to use large fonts in order for the elderly to be able to read them. And we could put the leaflets in, let's say, pharmacies, or in other places where senior citizens would meet, so in senior clubs and so on. So we could put these leaflets in places where the elderly could find them. So, for example, in pharmacies, in doctors' offices, or where senior clubs and so on. So places where the elderly people, where elderly people would meet. When it comes to kids and their parents, we could consider places such as playgrounds, such as shops with things for kids, and local kindergartens, local daycare institutions, and so on. And young people could be reached via their schools, sports grounds, and so on. So this is the way that we can proceed. So let's now pass to the next part of the lecture, which is connected with conflict. Conflict, which is an ever-appearing part of any dialogue, any negotiations, and it's a certain part of public consultations. So it's very important that we change our perception of conflict as something that should be avoided, because conflict is an ever-present part of interpersonal relations. It always appears. And basically denying the fact that conflicts appear leads to the fact that we can't manage the conflict, because only by acknowledging the conflict can we consciously manage the conflict. So basically a conflict appears when there are two sides and there's some discord, some disagreement, because one side perceives that their aims or values are in conflict with what the other side proposes, or the other side blocks the other side's aims and values and goals. And in general, people are afraid of conflict because they're perceiving conflict in the context of a fight, of a war, while we can actually change this perception, because it's pretty destructive actually. So we can try to have a look at the conflict and try to understand it and evaluate it, because evaluating the conflict is very important in order to be able to manage it later on. So we should be able to specify how much destructive motivation there is and how much constructive motivation there is, and we have to build on constructive motivation, obviously. And of course, managing the conflict is a very important skill that is nowadays taught at many business academies. It's actually very useful in everyday life. And in order to manage a conflict effectively, we need to be able to listen effectively, which I have already mentioned. We should be able to negotiate, and we should be able to be assertive. It's also important not to just perceive the conflict in time, but to perceive it in its real dimensions as if. So not to overestimate it and not to underestimate it. And in order to specify the risk of conflict, we could take into account several factors. So, for example, we could gather and analyze all the information concerning social tensions and social discontent, especially in the case of public consultations. We should remain in a certain distance towards the issue itself and towards the people who participate in the conflict, and we should consciously use some conflict management strategies. And we're actually going to look at some strategies which are connected with managing the conflict or negotiations and solving conflicts. As I'm sure you're aware, there are several styles of negotiations. We've got the so-called hard negotiating style, or hard bargaining, soft bargaining, and bargaining based on principles. And of course, I'm sure that you know people who negotiate in such ways. So when it comes to hard bargaining, of course, there's a very visible, very pronounced opposition between the winners and the losers, and obviously the aim is to win. The main aim is to satisfy your own demands. So what you're interested in is your full victory and the full defeat of the other side. And obviously the result is that one party is paying very high costs of the conflict, and the consequences are very, very destructive. When it comes to soft bargaining, usually one party, one side agrees to everything. In general, they don't protest, they finally give way entirely. And the consequence is that they end the conflict. The conflict ends with the fact that they feel manipulated, they feel that they have been cheated, and they actually feel that they have lost, that the other side has managed to get it all. And we've got there's a bargaining style which is based on principle, and let's have a look at it. There we've got a useful chart which compares these bargaining styles. These styles have been taken from a book which I recommend. Its title is Getting to Yes. So obviously the aim is to get to yes, to end our negotiations in a successful way. So let's have a look at this comparison of different bargaining styles: soft, hard, and principled. Soft, participants are friends; hard, participants are adversaries; and principled, participants are problem solvers. Soft style again: the goal is agreement; hard, the goal is victory of our side obviously; and principled, the goal is a wise outcome reached efficiently and amicably. So the aim is to solve the conflict in an amicable way. Well, some more characteristic qualities. In the soft style, you make offers. In the hard style, you make threats. While in the principled style, you avoid having a bottom line, and so on and so forth. These qualities of principled bargaining, I believe, are very, very useful not only in public consultations or professional negotiations, but also in everyday life, basically. And when it comes to positional bargaining as such, there are some key principles that should be observed, because negotiations are basically some kind of a game, and a game needs some rules, and we should be basing on these rules in order to revolve around the main issue of the conflict and not side issues, and in order to solve the conflict in such a way that is beneficial for both parties. So these are the basic principles. As regards people, separate people from problems. Concentrate on the problem and not on people. Be soft on people and be hard on the problem. When it comes to interests, concentrate on interests and not on people's stances. So this is what we should do. Possible solutions. Work out many possible solutions before you take a decision. This is a piece of good advice in order not to jump at solutions and not to accept them too hastily. And when it comes to criteria, demand that the outcome of the negotiations is based on objective criteria. And when it comes to conflict in public consultations, again, as we have mentioned, it's very important to recognize good sides of conflict. I know that this is in some way, it goes against our intuition, but it's quite important to change our perception, because only in this way we can find a way to manage conflict. So some of these benefits associated with conflict are, for example, the increase of motivations and people energy in order to overcome difficulties. The increase of innovation and finally managing to observe new points of view and feeling the need of making something better. People are in a way forced, or at least encouraged, to formulate their own views, to formulate their own arguments, and to establish their stance on some kind of an issue. And a conflict may also be a chance to make us aware of the issues that we're, for example, worried about, that we're concerned about, of our anxieties. Because conflict usually accompanies, always accompanies public consultations, it's very important to remember that conflicts must not be hushed down in a way. They must not be pushed aside. They have to be brought up into daylight, and they have to be solved, consciously solved. Because it's not true that an ideal situation is a situation without conflicts. This is basically an unrealistic expectation. And conflict also has several functions that it can perform. So first of all, it can be informative. It can provide us information on what is going on in a workplace or in a community. It can motivate, as we said, to be active, to improve the reality. It can function to it can lead to innovations, as we have also said, and it may function as a tool of identification. We can start to identify with a particular social group or with particular aims, and so on. So during public consultations, we're bound to come across very many different interests, a variety of interests. So this, of course, opens a large field of conflict. So in order to limit this conflict or to contain this conflict somehow, we should, first of all, provide honest and exhaustive information about all the aspects that are going to be consulted, because we have to be aware of the fact that if we don't, it's going to be used against us. People will assume that we're hiding something, that we're manipulating them, and so on. So it's very important to show our intentions, our good intentions, in an open way. And what's also important is the role of experts and officials and mentors, so who must not look down on people, on citizens, on inhabitants, but they have to treat them as partners, and they have to be polite, because politeness is very often the beginning of conflict. Another useful aspect to remember about is, first of all, specifying the areas that are negotiable and the areas that are not negotiable, and this will basically limit our negotiations, our discussion, only to the areas that may be negotiated. Yet another technique by means of which we could prepare for conflict, because conflicts, as we said, cannot be avoided, we can only be well prepared, is preparing a map of a social conflict. So basically, in this way, we have to use all the information that we find available. So, for example, press articles, any materials that our local government office may have, and anything else to show us whether there was a social conflict regarding the issue in question. So, for example, whether there were protests, whether there was some disagreement, whether some people chose to boycott some kind of a solution, and so on. So if we have such a map, it's also important to define our future allies, who is going to support our project, and to prepare a good package of information for the press, because of course press has a very important role in forming people's opinion on some issues. And very often this package of information has to be a completely separate entity, which is very well and carefully prepared and planned. And let me give you one example of a conflict syndrome that frequently appears with some kind of changes or new investments. This is the so-called NIMBY syndrome, which basically means not in my backyard. So you can guess what this is going to be about. This is about new investments that are going to be a nuisance to the inhabitants of a particular area. So something that is going to emit noise, something that is going to generate heavy traffic, for example, or traffic of very heavy vehicles, something that is going to emit bad smells, and so on. And of course, in such a way, everybody recognizes that such an investment is necessary, but they're going to say, all right, very well, but not in my backyard. And this syndrome, this conflict, this type of conflict is very difficult to solve. The only thing that we can do is to provide full information concerning the investment as such, and show people how they can influence all the procedures connected with this proposed change. We could also try to compensate the local community for the losses that they're going to incur. So, for example, show them the benefits, that, for example, there's going to be more work, that local shops are going to be doing better because of this huge factory that is going to be localized in their neighborhood. Or we could also give them basically some more benefits in terms of money or new developments, new solutions for their district. And the absolutely worst thing that can be done is trying to solve such a conflict, a NIMBY type conflict, in an administrative way. So basically just taking a decision regardless of people's interest. And this happened in Poland several years ago. There was a situation when local authorities were trying to build a ring road around the city of Augustów because trucks, lorries, heavy vehicles have been passing through the very center of the city, disturbing local residents, and obviously creating a nuisance, making the road dangerous. But the problem was that the area when they were trying to put the ring road on was an area of very high ecological importance. That is, it was basically almost a natural reserve, not a natural reserve in the full sense of the word. And it was very difficult to reach agreement on that issue, and so the authorities just decided to just took the decision without actually taking everybody's interests into consideration, and the conflict immediately escalated. There were mass protests of both sides, and finally the decision was actually overturned by court, so actually it came to nothing. So this issue was very difficult to solve, and the authorities just took the decision on their own without consulting, without taking into account the opinion of different stakeholders. And the result was that the conflict escalated immediately. There were mass protests, everything was on the news, and in fact it finally ended in the court overruling the decision of the authorities. So in a way it all came to nothing. So definitely this is not the right way to solve such conflicts. Well, the basic method of solving such conflicts is organizing meetings when both parties confront each other. But actually such meetings are usually, a part of public consultations. So usually we would not organize such meetings as separate entities. There's also an alternative technique of managing a conflict, which is called BATNA. BATNA means best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and this is what it precisely is, trying to work out the best alternative if an agreement is not reached. This way of solving problems, solving conflicts has been prepared by Harvard negotiation projects. And the alternatives are basically meant to answer the question, what is going to happen if our negotiations fail? And there are 3 steps to BATNA. So first of all, we have to brainstorm for all the possible solutions that could be taken if the negotiations fail. Secondly, we take some of the most promising alternatives and we turn them into actual possibilities of action. And thirdly, we pick one option out of these, the one that seems to be better, and this is precisely BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So this is something that the authorities of Augustów could have used instead of just taking a sovereign decision. So this is actually the end of the lecture as such. So let me summarize what we have been talking about. So during the lecture, we have focused on communication in public consultations, and the issue that is imminently connected with communication, that is conflict. Conflict on both social and individual level, and the ways of predicting conflict and managing the conflict, as well as techniques of negotiations. 2 most important things that I would like you to remember from this lecture are actually quite general, but still they're very much worth bearing in mind. So as regards communication, the most important principle regarding successful communication is putting ourselves into the shoes of our addressee. So thinking the way that our audience thinks. And as regards conflict, we should not deny conflict. We should rather direct all the energy that would have been otherwise put into trying to calm the conflict down into preparing well for the conflict and managing it effectively. So in order to sum up, let me just say that public consultations are a very complex and multi-layered process because what we have to do is, first of all, we have to gather and distribute information. We have to prepare a communication strategy. We have to identify key stakeholders and get them involved in our social dialogue. And we have to prepare and conduct meetings during which many very often controversial issues will be discussed. Very often many conflicts will take place during such meetings. So as you can see, public consultations are indeed a very demanding process. Thank you very much.